Hi guys, welcome to this PASS lecture. This has been organised by PASS, which is a team of students who our aim is kind of just to create like networking community within the architecture community, and with people outside of university. And today we're lucky enough to have Piers Taylor. Make sure to follow us on our social medias on Instagram and Facebook to be updated about upcoming lectures and any other events we have. So I'll pass over to Ryan.
Yeah, hi guys. Like we said, we've got Piers come to talk for us today. You might recognize him from the World's Most Extraordinary Homes on Netflix. He's one of the hosts. It's a very good show. I recommend you watch it. He's just come to talk about his work, about architecture. It's going to be great. Quickly before we start, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and they'll be answered in the end or as the talk goes on. Yeah, so over to you, Piers.
Great. Hi, everybody. As Ryan said, I'm Piers Taylor. Can you screen? Actually, you can't see my screen. I'm not sharing a screen. I'm just going to try again to share my screen and then, so I go share. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So I think I'm going to try and touch on this idea of community and what it might mean. And I'm starting now. Yeah, is that okay?
Oh, yeah, he is starting now.
Is that okay? Is that good?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, let me tell them.
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, great. You can hear me definitely?
Yeah, can hear you.
Great.
It's all good.
So I'll start again. I'm going to try and weave in this sort of ongoing question about what community is. And I haven't come to any conclusions, but what I do know is that we're trying to stop using this word in our organization because it's come to be kind of presumptive. And one of the dangerous things, I think, when we use this word community is that we imply there are these people, they're real and authentic. Anyone outside that isn't part of this. And I guess more
Piers, I think you're muted.
Someone muted me. Anyway, okay, so I am really interested in this idea that we're all global citizens, we're all citizens of the world. If we care about any serious issue, poverty, climate crisis, we can only think about these things as global issues. And I don't believe in the nation state. I don't believe in borders. I don't believe in boundaries. And I think it's kind of interesting, if we look at a very recent map of the United Kingdom where I happened to be now when, only 20,000 years ago, there was this piece of land called Doggerland that linked it to mainland Europe. And what is incredibly depressing for me is that we've come in this country to think of ourselves as a kind of island community where, of course, we're nothing but. And in fact, I would even stop the word, I stopped using the word we when I talk about this country, because at the moment it's so divided and I feel I can't understand in many ways how, as a nation, we're able to kind of reconcile all of our differences currently. But I think more importantly, I think that the idea of community, particularly in a kind of COVID world, is much wider than a sense of geography. And I feel part of various communities, none of which particularly have any bearing on geography. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about this over the next sort of 3/4 of an hour or so. But I'm speaking now from near Bath, where there are these 5 valleys that come in, and it's a kind of water-worn piece of landscape. And I'm speaking, in fact, right now from this woodland that sits around the house that I've been living and working in for about 20 years or so. And this is a landscape that I've been in for some time now, and curiously I've come to feel a sense of physical belonging in a place that's to do with a kind of geographical territory rather than necessarily any people that are part of this community, although there are people in this community that I'm going to talk about who have given me a great deal. And we came to this place 20 odd years ago because we didn't have much money and we wanted space to build, which I felt somehow was important. And I'd moved out of London when I was at the AA and studied originally in Australia, where there was very much this kind of sense of space. And I, as an architect, I needed and felt the need to have space around me in which I could build. So we bought a piece of land that is in part of an old country estate that was affordable to us because it had no car access. So there was this old building on it that we still are attached to, that is the old part of our house. And we bought this for a very little amount of money because you couldn't drive to it, and it was unsellable in many ways because you couldn't take a car to it and there wasn't a patch of tarmac outside. And, you know, the bits that were falling down didn't bother me. But what was curious about this building was that it was in denial of where it was, because it sits under the shadow of this big ash tree. And as the ash tree had grown, the building had dropped into the land because of the highly shrinkable water-worn clay. And then the building, of course, has had very few windows and was really in denial of the things that we care about when we think about places, which is this kind of connection, this tangible sort of haptic and tacit physical connection to places. I mean, you didn't know where this place was when you're inside this building. So this is the shape of the valley from the bottom of the garden here. And this is where we look out over towards the other side of the valley. And it's the only one of these 5 valleys around Bath that has no road going through it. So it's a very beautiful and particular piece of landscape. And the buildings that I was interested in were the buildings that I've been introduced to by my old tutors in Australia. And they were incredibly rudimentary agricultural buildings that I came back from Australia and I talked about these buildings and being interested in these buildings because they were influenced by weather and geography and geology. And I remember my tutors at the AA saying, that stuff doesn't mean anything here. You know, get over that stuff, doesn't mean anything. But what's so interesting about these buildings is, of course, they're not really architecture, but they were more interesting to me than these kind of high modernist icons that we were supposed to revere. They were direct, simple buildings, but importantly, these buildings know where the weather is. And if you look at the building on the left, you'll know that the wind comes in from the other side of it, and the farmer has orientated it to the east because he knows in this valley that the wind never drives the rain in from the east. And he keeps this grain in this one because he knows he can store it up to the top of the concrete and the wind and the rain can drive through. And these buildings are incredibly tuned to where they are. And the materials that most people build from around here were just this very simple, straightforward profiled corrugated metal and plywood. And that was the kit of parts that was available to us just from our local agricultural store when we started to build. But importantly, I think we felt the weight of every single thing we consumed to come down a path to the building. Every single thing we consumed and every bit of waste that we produced had to come up and down a path that was 500 yards long. And the house was a simple derivative diagram inherited from my old tutor in some ways, who was Glenn Murcutt in Australia, where it was an idea of a building which was completely transparent on the ground floor that you could look through as soon as you came through the woodland. So it didn't disturb this site that ran through it, touching the ground with these tiny little foundations that went deep into the ground so the water table to the big ash tree would remain undisturbed. A place above with these slats that allowed you to see out when you're inside but to have privacy, and then the roof kicked up to bring the wind, to bring the sun in first thing in the morning, and a reverse eaves on one side of the building only was to protect the entry side from the wind and the rain when you came out of the woods carrying stuff. So this is what we built, and of course what you can see is the bits that are solid are where we needed shade, and the bits that are transparent are where we got shade from that big ash tree. And here, that other side, that transparency through the building, that glass at the top that brings the first bit of light in the morning, and then the timber that has glass behind it that allows you to see out, but you can't see in. And it was made out of stuff that we just got from our local builders merchants, and actually is the same stuff as our local B&Q shed, which is on the right-hand side of this slide, and the house was on the left-hand side. So this is then the relationship to the old building, and this is the inside, everything unfinished, just cheap shuttering ply on the floor, unpainted plaster on the ceiling, exposed timber frame, and the only things that's painted is a sort of £500 kitchen, which is where the services drop. And again, every bit of the building exposed, the timber in the floor, the beams, what's in tension, what's in compression, the landscape, the walls inflected to refer you to landscape. But other than that, incredibly simple, direct, self-built, Walter Siegel-esque timber frame. So this is as it was, and I'm going to end in about half an hour or so with a 20-year update to this building, which we have corrected some of the deficiencies within it. But of course, that's a kind of pretty place for middle-class people, although we built it on a shoestring. And the reality is that places like that don't really need architecture. The places that need architecture are places like this. This is Bristol, the south and east area of Bristol, where this is the high street in this area of Hartcliffe when I went to work there about 15 years ago. And this is daytime, you know, 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock during the day, weekday, and this is the state of that high street. And we were asked to provide a purpose-built studio for a group of excluded children who were excluded from a school, in a failing school, excluded from school because they were somehow unteachable. And a program was set up to work with this resident artist who would work alongside these children and try and get them back into mainstream education. But this was the kind of buildings that existed there. This is how they treated people, covering the razor wire, trying to keep them out. And this was the type of marks that people make in that building I felt was really important. And what was really important for us was, how can we honor the life of the building and not deny this kind of mark making that goes on inside the building? This is the site that we were given here, and this is looking the other way. And this is what we were asked to do, which is just to fill in that courtyard with a simple flat-roofed building. But of course, as we all know, you never do what you're asked to do. You always do something else. And what we decided to do was pull the building away from that school to make a gallery, an external gallery space, a making courtyard between the building and the school. And this sense for us was important, that when you go out of the school, you went into another world that then only referred you through two apertures to the sky. You couldn't see where you were, you could only see the sky like this. So this is what we built here. And this is modeling those apertures to make sure that you could only see the sky. And then we had this idea that we would make it out of just stuff, again, that you could get from any local builder's merchant just down the road. And you could build it with any kind of skill, however low or untrained that was. So it was made out of concrete block, blue EPDM, standard Velux windows, and nothing else. It was then left as an unfinished building that invited people to take over it and use it and make marks on it. So inside was unfinished plaster, raw, bare concrete on the floor, OSB running round to protect the bottom of the building. So this is kind of as it was, and this is how it's used now by the children that work and use this studio. This is the marks they're making on the floor here. And this is how they're using it. For me, over time, the building is getting better and better and better as the finishes are given by the life and the people that exist in this thing. And I hate this idea that a building is a kind of sanitized thing that we're scrubbing off the marks of life. After we did that building, we're then invited to do a lot of other primary school work. And we decided that working with children was super interesting. So we set up a little office at our local school for a year or two, where the first building that we did with them, we built with the pupils as part of their curriculum activities, was a little bike store. And that went, a bike shelter, and that went really well. So we got a little bit of money from some grant to make the dining hall. Historically, kids had school dinners, and then there was this thing that they would have packed lunches. And then recently, up until recently, there was this idea that they would have school dinners and they needed a dining hall. And this was a part of a group of children that modeled this first scheme that was too expensive. And then that same group of children with some others worked with us to understand, this is a model made by the children, to understand how you could span 11 meters as economically as possible with unseasoned timber by turning it into a bowstring truss and then running very short section timber between and then gluing in the glass, but opening up timber flats to make it really cheap and efficient to build. So we made it with the children down in Charlie Brentnell's workshop. And this is then the building as it was handed over. And it was less than then £1,000 a square metre, which was incredibly cheap. And you're all, I'm sure, too young to remember that this was a time when Michael Gove, who was then I think Minister for Education, was telling people that schools were squandering, architects were squandering public money and shouldn't be let near school buildings. And we delivered this for far less than the kind of prefabricated buildings he was suggesting that people should procure. So this is as it is now, many years later, and in summer now with a kind of growth around it there. So around this time, I guess about 15 years ago, I was running third year at the University of Bath. And, you know, as you will know, what's really interesting when you're a student of architecture or an architect is that, you know, if you're a student of architecture, you work on an approximation of the thing. You work on a model, you work on a drawing, you work on a render. You never work on a building, but you can never occupy and inhabit the space that you had imagined. So a group of us set up this thing called Studio in the Woods, where every summer we would get together with students, we'd eat together and we'd run talks, but most importantly, we'd build together, build in a way that was very different from the way that we'd build in the studio. We'd build very quickly with materials to hand that were just taken from the site, typically milled to order, and we'd build quickly to explore ideas and test ideas at one-to-one with structures over 3 or 4 days only that we could physically get into, inhabit, understand, and use as a way of really understanding what does it mean to build something and occupy it spatially, which is a kind of something that is denied completely to you at architecture school typically, where we only ever work in a funny kind of code space. So these are the kind of scale of some of the things that we build. It's still happening now, you know, 15 or so years later. But I think as I was doing this, the reason I'm talking about this program is that it was a really important program for me to understand what my relationship with making was. And in fact, this is an extraordinary community of people that come together every year. And, you know, I call my practice Invisible Studio because historically I called Studio in the Woods an invisible studio that would come together and then disappear and make stuff together. But to give you an example about how my thinking changed as a practitioner and as a teacher was this project that we did, Studio in the Woods, one year, where, you know, we'd go about this project in a still conventional manner. We'd work out what something needed to be like. This is a test piece to work out where you needed to place a person to be in a piece of light over a river. And then we made a piece of shape to fit that. And although the making of it was kind of interesting, we kind of knew what shape this thing was going to be. We pre-imagined this as architects do, and then we made it. And as I was doing this, I was kind of thinking there might be another way to do something, but I'm not sure what that is. So this is, of course, the piece we made that year. So next year, with all that buzzing around in my mind, when we did the same thing, we placed a person in a particular point of space to get a piece of winter light. I started to realize that all this temporary infrastructure that sits around this is very interesting. And although in this case, we pre-imagined something, we sat here, we worked out how to make it, and then we made it. This, in a way, is still guilty of being incredibly conventional and made in a way that architects always make stuff. We pre-imagine it, we make it, and that's the end of the story. But as I was making it with these students and with people like Charlie Brentnell, what I realized is all of this temporary logistics, all this stuff that happens that allows people to winch this stuff into place is more interesting than the finished artifact. So that stayed with me, and that became a kind of manifesto for how I have tried to work kind of ever since. So all that temporary stuff remains in the building. The point of making is that you can use it to pre-imagine something, to imagine something better than you can pre-imagine. So the following year, we made this piece where we tested a joint, and then as a group, we kind of worked together to choreograph something into place by pulling, pushing simultaneously without pre-imagining something This was a kind of made and frozen piece of time that could only be made by pulling, pushing, winching in a certain point in time to make these points in space. Around that time, I got a call from the AA, the Architectural Association, saying, would I be interested in helping them set up a new program at Hook Park in Dorset, where was a 400-acre woodland that had been bequeathed to the AA by this guy, John Makepeace, and he had tried and sort of failed to set up a centre for making there. And it was a 400-acre woodland where the AA had built some incredible buildings with Fry Otto and ABK and Bure Happold, where they'd taken very small section waste timber and had worked out how they might use this in big span construction. So we worked, and in fact, the AA had used those buildings for a number of years, just as sort of temporary workshops where people would come for London. But we had this idea that it could be a permanent home for a new program that was a master's, where people would come and spend 16 or 18 months designing and constructing buildings. So Andrew Freer from Rural Studio came and ran a unit which got an outline consent for a new campus. On the left, a big assembly workshop where we'd build everything on the right, student accommodation and staff accommodation in this kind of clearing in the woodland. So that was an outline consent imagined by Andrew Freer's unit that was then sort of handed out to us as AA Design and Make to effectively to build with students over a period of 10 years or so. So the first building that we did was the big shed, the assembly workshop, where the first AA Design and Make cohort worked with us to design a big span structure made out of small person-sized ad hoc components, which could be built in an incredibly simple and direct manner. So this is some of their experiments, looking at how people conventionally join timber, which is to pull it away, spend a lot of money on a piece of high-tech engineering, which blows your budget instantly. It doesn't really use timber in a kind of intelligent manner. And timber engineering is really all about the connection. So this is what we did with Atelier 1, who were the engineers, and they said, stop trying to be clever and just make the building as a series of linear trusses and then joist it out as you would any other linear building. But in this case, innovate with a house builder's screw that is a 300 mil long house builder's screw that we can test here in the Material Science Laboratory at Bath University. And we can just use a simple screw to screw this building together. So this is working out whether or not the screws could deal with the pullout. This is doing deflection tests on all the timber. This is looking at the pullouts and working out that, in fact, we could, with very low skills, student labor, screw the entire building together and take out all those expensive steel connections. So we set up site down there, and with Charlie Brentnell holding it together, my office doing all the detailed design, spent the summer building this building with students and interns. So first truss going up, and then 6 trusses, the rest of the trusses, cladding coming right off the saw onto the building and being built here by students working alongside a main contractor as part of their learning and part of their, ultimately, their thesis investigation. This is the building as built. Here it forms this kind of arrival and entrance into Hook Park, which you can visit actually if you book, and at night. And then internally, the building there, looking up, and then students, the following year's students, then using this workshop to build their own house that they built and then inhabited for 6 months while they were writing their thesis on an aspect of that building. And curiously, the students here had never built a building before and had never used many tools before. So kind of super interesting program. This was their, this was the building here, and this is the big shed now, how it's used still sort of 10 years later or so by AA Design and Make to build, experiment, fabricate with their robotic arm, build these kind of buildings in. So this is, another building they built sort of 3, 4, 5 years later, which is the library, the wood chip barn. That was a barn where they scanned all the trees in the woodland and took those trees and married the forks together to make a continuous truss out of those trees here, that then became the central backbone and spine to this building. They could only understand by scanning all of these things. By the way, Ryan, I've just had an alert that I've only got 7 minutes left apparently, and I think it seems that I only have a 40-minute slot right from when we started at 5 o'clock, so I'm slightly nervous we're going to get cut off, but anyway. So that's looking up, and that's the building as it is now. And also they then built something exploring tension timber and a little folly, etc., etc. This program still exists here. But the problem with that program in many ways is that it's still a program where you have to come and spend a lot of money as a student to go and build something, learn how to build something. And my journey away from Hook was exploring how that can be more accessible to people who go to conventional universities or people that aren't even at universities, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So this is Hook Park here, and the next little building that we were invited to do very quickly was a caretaker's house to fulfill an outline consent for which had fulfill a planning condition where we had to take away the caretaker's porta cabin and replace it by a certain date. So we were asked to develop a student concept for a very simple, small house, which was designed to show you how you could use green timber from a radius of 500 yards and build a building insulated to passive house standards. So a simple linear building facing south, north, heavy north wall, very few windows on the north side, simple inflection to one side looking over the yard for supervision, simple inflection to the east where the light can come in to the bedrooms. North side here, very solid, very thick wall, single aperture really into it that defines entrance, bedrooms kicking up to the east, and supervision kicking up to the west, looking over the yard there, which is the living space for the caretaker. Incredibly complex cladding, every piece of cladding different as it rised up around the building there. You can see how complex that each piece of cladding is, which is different. This isn't a good way of making a building, but the kind of opportunities given to you when you can do your own buildings are kind of extraordinary. I'm using timber just again off the saw, 5 different species here. Hannah, who did those drawings then, that's her fixing the cladding there. And this is then the building kind of soon after it was finished. Internally, you know, again, we made everything, made the staircase, made the kitchen, staircase just poplar, no fixings, shrinking together to give it its stability, made the taps, you know, this is it as it was kind of occupied and finished. But I guess I felt this unease that we were still doing something that was kind of somehow elitist, and I wanted to find out if there's a way of doing kind of really direct, simple buildings with just the materials and the people around us in, I guess, a kind of community. So this is the house that I described is on the bottom, just on the left of where it says Google. And then above that, at the top left of the screen, is the studio that I'm in now that we then decided to build. And what I wanted to do was just build a building using the trees from the footprint of the building and no other material at all, and then build a building really as cheaply as I possibly could, or for the cost of 1 year's rent, and then only work with people who were amateurs, who had never been in, never built anything before. So then the other thing that I guess really interests me is what kind of drawings do you do if you, sorry, Ben's saying something, you don't need to read a drawing, you can just build up and out and the building effectively carries on going, which makes it incredibly cheap, incredibly kind of simple to understand, which means that people can work on this building and build this building regardless of their level of making skill, which is something I'm very interested in. I'm also really interested in this idea of wastage, and this building used we built our own scaffolding that became the floor, that became also the furniture. We pieced together the insulation that's on the roof, on the ceiling from seconds that we bought from eBay. And there is almost no wastage in this building, and there's almost no temporary infrastructure. Every single thing that we needed to build the building was there as we were doing the building. There wasn't temporary infrastructure that went away. There wasn't any wastage, which again, I think is a really, for me, really kind of interesting idea. And I became kind of fascinated by this idea of a kind of architecture of frugality, where you really built as economically as possible. So you can see obviously the studio behind me now, and underneath then we, a few years ago, ran Studio in the Woods here. So it's a super flexible space with these canvas blinds that drop down, and you know, here 70 people or so on underneath with a temporary kitchen, log store at the moment, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So that became again a kind of manifesto for how we could build around here, doing our own buildings, which was incredibly liberating for an architect, where much of your life is waiting for the phone to ring to do a commission for somebody else. So alongside the kind of proper grown-up buildings we were doing, we were experimenting with our own buildings. The next little building we built was a compost toilet. We built for zero cost, no tiny little building that we just used waste materials lying around the place, an off-hired digger to build, again, unskilled people, old tiling battens for the bridge, old slates for the cladding, and then that became the bathroom for the studio, kind of zero waste building, built for nothing, just with people that live and work around here, without any knowledge that they were doing architecture. I think what's most interesting for me is that they didn't know or even consider that they were doing a piece of architecture, or even doing something that they would consider making. Of course, do the drawing after we built the building, and then build the model after that. So there became a way of beginning to do buildings for ourselves here that I think was really sort of interesting for me. The next little building that we built was a building that, again, just used the material resource of, we had a lot of spruce, small section of spruce and larch and cedar that we took out, that we milled entirely into 5-inch by 125 by 50, thinking that we could build anything out of that. So we had a glut of that timber, and it was in stick for a year or two, and then we wanted to build another little workshop, got another digger, same people who are beginning to develop better carpentry skills now, came and helped build this little studio here, which is effectively, there's 2 trusses that came together, built there as a kit of parts, you can see, and then this is what we call our ghost barn, where we use for prototyping and so on. We then, with the same timber, a few years later, built a little prototype relocatable house here called Trailer, just out of that same kit of parts. Long building that is designed to be towed on a public highway, made from a series of frames that repeat, stack up, so you have a template to make the next one. Trailer taken down there, which took all of the frames down, which we then put up with people that live around here. So Simon Standing is a trapeze artist, Jim is Standing is one of Charlie Brentnell's apprentices. Frames going up in a very simple way that is inherited from Walter Siegel, this idea that anyone can build in this very direct post and beam type manner. This is the little building here. It's kind of, I guess we built it as overspill accommodation for people that were coming to teach here, people coming to work here, whatever. Internally unfinished, it's a reverse hoarding. We bought a hoarding that we then turned around. The blue paint that you see on hoardings is on the other side. So the shuttering ply we then sanded down and used for every finish internally, old rope for all the handrails, all that kind of stuff, and so on. And there it is now. In fact, my daughter and her partner live in it because, of course, like everyone else, they can't afford to buy a house. There they are there. This is after they've been living in it for a couple of years, their bedroom, those blue ropes, and after they've been living in it for 3 years now or so. So you get the sense of this place here, how we operate as a kind of practice. But also we do proper buildings for people with that kind of ethos. So this is a building we did for a government organization, the Forestry Commission, the Westernbert Arboretum, that is the biggest collection, the best collection of timber, I think, in the country, the National Arboretum. And so we won, we navigated the sort of, OJU procurement nightmare process to win 2 buildings initially, and then now a 3rd for them. And initially they asked us just to make them a big shed, they wanted a big at-cost shed, and we looked at taking their timber, cutting it up in a manner that we could build, again, with unskilled labor. But then I think we worked out that they had the best timber, the best collection of timber in the country. So it's like, well, why would we, cut that up? So we took their timber, which was coming out anyway, these huge pieces of Corsican pine, milled them, and then, so this is what they asked us to build here. And of course, what we thought was that we in fact wouldn't build a complex kind of look at me type building like we built at Hook Park, but build something incredibly simple to the point where it could hardly be considered architecture. And every small place in the world that is in any part of any rural community has recognizably a kind of typology where the sort of open plan, big roof buildings are places where people work, and the sort of more upright buildings are where people live and go to get warm. And we thought, well, we'll just build that really and not overthink it. So a little place to get warm, that's the mess building, and a big open plan building where people can come and work. And of course, that every little special building with a steeply pitched roof, something else happens there. So we thought maybe we'll build something a little bit like that. The trees were the biggest trees ever used in continuous pieces in construction ever, I think. And they were too big to move anywhere, too big to do anything with. So we ran too big to mill conventionally. So we ran a hewing workshop where volunteers would come and hew these trees by hand down to the required sizes. And they were then dragged by a tractor to our site, where we then made a series of heavy carpentry trusses. We've given the money on the basis that we ran a whole series of training programs with volunteers who made these, and students from the carpentry college locally who came to make these trusses, again with Charlie Brentnell. You see the scale of a person in the middle of that, huge piece of timber with continuous 22 meter long bottom cord that was absolutely massive. Pieces of timber, and then use the waste timber on the outside of the building in a random selection because we didn't know what we were going to have, and then a person-sized door to remind you of the scale of the building. So again, that was what we were asked to build. We thought, well, actually, we can build something better. We can build that. So that's what we built, and that's the side of it with that sort of random timber here. So again, as a reminder, that's what we were asked to build. That's what we built, and that's the scale of a person. Happens to be Barack Obama. Who didn't come, he's photoshopped in. That's how big the building is compared to a person there. So almost no architecture, but for me, a really kind of simple way of just working in a place with the materials and the people that you have around you and nothing else, reminding you, of course, of the buildings that I showed you earlier. And next to it, the little mess room that we built that has one inflection to bring the light in the morning and nothing else, into the yard in the morning, drops down. This is that building built in a different manner. Again, it's a simple mess room, but we built it with people, again, who built it with oak, which was a complex material to use, and built it with very low skill people. So it was designed to cover up, it was designed to be skinned in plywood, so you could really build anything and then you could conceal that, and that kind of would be fine. Double curvature here, you can see that inflection where the light comes over the top at 9 in winter into the yard, faces south to get the solar gain in, and then internally that's the space. And again, we kind of made everything super cheap building this, made the kitchen obviously again like a hook, concrete worktop, et cetera, et cetera. Very quickly, a couple of urban buildings, and I don't just want to work in rural contexts. We're working in, and I don't think of ourselves as a rural practice. And I think what's interesting about working in the city is that it's a completely different context. And cities, just in a straightforward sense, when you look at this city here, happens to be Bath, the only two buildings that you can see where we design them as architects do, typically, buildings that we compose the elevations of, draw in the round, are the two churches, nothing else. Every other bit of building in this place is just a backdrop to public realm. And I really enjoy working on buildings that are just part of a place. They're not a single object. They're just part of a landscape of placemaking where the building is just backdrop to public realm and it isn't about the building. But also cities really are the future. 50% of the world lives in the cities now compared to 2% when my grandparents were alive or born. And in my kids' lifetime, it'll go to 80%. And because of that, it allows, most of humanity to live on a small proportion of land and consume far fewer resources. So this is a little building, or medium-sized building we did in the town that I live near at the moment, the sort of blackish building you just see on the left of that. But this, on the left of the slide, is the bath that most people will know, whether they've been to Bath or not. It's the kind of terraced bath, formal bath. But as you go close to the river, often historically, rivers were where interesting things happened. You know, materials came up, goods came up, trade happened, and with these artisan yards. And we negotiated hard with the local authority for several years to open up the river edge, which means that every consent from now or then until, you know, whenever, that comes up along this piece of river has to open up the piece along the river for public access. So eventually you'll be able to walk from the edge of town to the centre of town along the river. And we also negotiated with the yards adjacent that we could build, we could link our yard to their yard. So ultimately people will be able to walk from yard to yard to yard to yard as they could historically. I can't move my cursor on this, I can't point to anything. But again, the sort of buildings, the informal buildings that sit along the river with their kind of informal language of staircase and, you know, the very direct buildings are really, for me, super interesting. And again, you know, you look at this and you can understand everything that you need to know about how you bring light in, how you might access. This sort of no architecture is something that I really love. So these are the buildings, this is the kind of diagram. We just made a yard, and we made public space in the middle and then pushed all of our buildings to the edges. And we made a clinic and some houses that paid for it. So the houses had to be on the river, the best bit, light scoops to bounce light in, and then the clinic on the left-hand side, so you could lie on your back and look up at the sky when you're having a kind of treatment. And then above that, martial arts studio. So this is the buildings here, sort of funny, strange, too much accommodation, which I like. So, you know, one of the people who lived around, who opposed the building when we were building it, came back to us and said, you know, I get it now, I like it. What I like about it is that there's too much accommodation, that it bulges out over the site as it would have done in medieval times and makes dense person-sized spaces in the city. So this is the dark bit of public realm that wraps into, invites you into this courtyard. You can walk then through to the next yard here, that's looking into that yard, houses on one side, clinic on the other, window box that pops out so you can see who's coming when you're up in there. And that's looking that into the next yard there, that dark public realm, bring you in, more private spaces that sit above, slots into the treatment room so you can bring light in, but you can't see into them. And that's looking across the river there. There's light scoops that bring light into the houses with the views maintained for the buildings beyond there by cutting down around the buildings. That's then the martial arts studio, the dojo, bringing light in there, and that link across into the changing area. Not long to go now. Perhaps the most significant building that I've worked on recently is a building or a series of buildings that we were given a huge amount of public money to build because my client invested in understanding how these buildings could be part of a process of change. This is a place called Watchet. That's the area of the United Kingdom that has the lowest social mobility. So if you're born poor, you stay poor. And the reason it's like that in some ways is that it was a place where goods could come and go, and there was rope making and trade, but then that bit of the Bristol Channel became too expensive to dredge, and you couldn't bring trade in from the sea, and there's no links back to Bristol or now and Cardiff, of course, or Swansea. So industry kind of died, and it was a place that had sort of been abandoned by the local authority. So the community interest company that I've been working with for 6 or 7 years now set out an idea that there could be 4 projects that would reanimate this town, bring this town back to life. It happens that we did number 3 first. There was a little visitor centre, which means that people come into the centre of the town now, walk back up to the visitor centre and down the high street, which has allowed the high street to reopen before people then come back down the esplanade, back into the centre of town. But the site that I'm going to talk about is number 1 here, which is the East Quay, was a marina site. So 4 women who were in their 30s, who had never initiated a building, knew nothing about procurement, spent 4 years getting their town together to work out what this town needed to bring them together, to make change, create jobs and benefit the economy. And what they did was set up a community interest company that effectively works out how every community can be the best version of themselves. So what they looked at was these issues, and they could state that this is what they were trying to solve. So what we needed to do was effectively fit our buildings to these things. We need to work out with them how a building could be part of a process of social change. So this is then our site on the right-hand side. You can see these ordinary houses and domestic scale buildings sitting on top of this kind of very heavy plinth. This is some of that industry that used to be there, kind of rope making and so on. And effectively, the first thing that we needed to do was make sure that the site was linked back as much as it could possibly be to the town. So we made a new link to the coastal path, a new link, pedestrian link up to the top of town, and effectively imagined this as another piece of public realm that wrapped around the site and brought people in as a kind of promenade that people would have done in Victorian times in this part of West Somerset. And then we imagined a very simple building that just formed a courtyard that pushed itself to the back of the site, which means that you can come off at first floor from the hill behind where the coastal path is into the top of the site, into the walk on the plinth. And then we decided we'd make a series of little artist studios that sat on the plinth, where the spaces around them became more important than the buildings themselves. But if you look at this part of West Somerset, the building top left is so ordinary and yet so strange. It's the buildings that we see up and down this bit of the coast all of the time, these playful little, diddy little structures that sit in this coastal landscape. And then these very strong ways on the next image on the right that these big, person-made interventions where people come up, move up through this strata. Bottom left, which is Clevedon Pier, which shows this sort of idea of public promenade in, the seaside, this coastal landscape that I think is really interesting. We thought, well, all of that kind of makes sense, and that's kind of what we can do. So this is the plates here, and these are the buildings then. So this is a plinth at ground floor with small buildings that are stacked up, jostling for position on top, that ultimately just sit alongside a new piece of public realm at first floor, which you can then look into this courtyard that sits below, in which there's a gallery and a series of other activities like a cafe and education spaces that spill out into it. With behind that, a new link for the coastal path that invites people to come in. So you can see a little bit more of how that works here. So we make a plinth just out of stuff from the ground that we effectively extrude. That's number one. Number two, we make some big studios. Number three, we dot around those much smaller studios that could be built over time if needed. Then ultimately the spaces around them become spaces that those studios can spill out into and animate and take over in a very informal and ad hoc manner. This is some of that early section looking at how the buildings can relate to the coastal path, how we can bring light into the galleries, how people can move around, that kind of stuff. Section, rear elevation from the coastal path, looking at this building here, and you'll walk in to this building here, there, like that. And then this is the courtyard, the buildings above, all of that public realm sitting around the building there. My friend Meredith described it as a plinth with some tat on top of it. And then that's looking at this new public realm that wraps around the front of the building there. So what this building does, and my client can demonstrate this, is do all of this, which is a kind of extraordinary thing. Through their own kind of enterprise, they have made a facility that will create 37 new jobs, all of the other indirect jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's an extraordinary thing that they have done to demonstrate how buildings can be part of a process of change, but then also what the impact of those buildings is. I mean, mind-blowing in some ways to be part of a process like that. This is as it was a few months ago, and this is, I don't know if I can play this film actually, but that was a little film that shows you kind of where the building is now anyway. So then a couple of little things to almost finish with. At another scale, I guess one of these things that we've been kind of grappling with as architects is what is our relationship with material post-industrial revolution, when you could just take a material out of the ground and use it, and now we can use anything. And we don't just want to work in timber, and we're interested in material generally. So we were asked to make some buildings for a hotel with a much bigger budget in Somerset. Buildings with a budget that I've never worked on. But what was really interesting for us is there could be a kind of research for how to take material from the ground and use it in a very different manner. That's what's happened to my screen here. 2 slides missing, doesn't matter. I wonder, oh gosh, it's not working. I wonder why that's not working. So something's happened to my, hang on a second, to my to go back into that. And for some reason, maybe you're saved by the bell, because something has happened to my presentation where it has corrupted. But what I could just quickly probably show you is, we have a few more minutes, is to open, if I open a different version of that, sorry about this technology, what's happened, something's corrupted. So just hold on a second. And that has corrupted too, right? So this is the problem with working, everything now virtually on Dropbox means that if something corrupts if you do something on one computer and it can't save it on the other, then you're kind of screwed. Anyway, I have an older version of this where I'll just kind of run through some of those slides here. I was really talking about how in this context, what was most interesting for us was understanding. We're asked to make a building that sat in this wall here. And we thought that it could be really interesting to make a building that was kind of just no building, that just formed the southern edge of a vegetable garden that was a kind of gym for this hotel. The program isn't that interesting, actually. But really just took this material and crushed it and reused it as an external wall material. So all of our investment was just in that one move. How can this material, how can we take it and just use it? And again, use that for the external wall of the building. So this is that external wall, and we wanted to do this, just place a building in that wall here that is this building. So that material became crushed, lime added, and then we used it, rammed in dry mix, rammed into this external wall here. And then a single piece of glass that I think is the biggest, apparently biggest window in the world outside of Apple in California there. I think it's kind of 15 meters long or something. So it's kind of one move, one material, and one experience where you can be in this space, immersed in this kind of sensory garden here. So it's a person in it looking at that kind of landscape. Internally, again, just one material that's beach that just wraps around that. Again, that's the kind of material, springtime, you see poppies out, rammed earth, coming up, which we're now developing and using in two other buildings, in fact, on a much, much bigger scale. So kind of super interesting to learn how to use a new material in a kind of interesting way, I think, here. So no coloring, it's just that stone taken, used, crushed and rammed with some lime and some sand. We're then doing another little building that isn't finished quite yet, which is an apiary on an old landfill site, which was a landfill site that has now been made into a nature habitat, where an apiary building will sit. This is the apiary building as we've made it. It's kind of waiting now for 6 months whilst this extraordinary three-dimensional enclosure is built around these steels, where bees can come into and live in this building in these kind of enclosures with apertures that take them out to the outside, and then you can come in and walk around and experience three-dimensionally the kind of life cycle of bees and how they live and everything else. So this is the old pond from the outside that is now, sorry, the old landfill site that is now a pond. The building as it is now waiting for this fit out. On the left, you can see these hives that come in, waiting for other observational hives to be placed within them. There's the steel beams waiting for these honeycomb structures to be placed with it over them, where the bees will live. That's that copper roof, and so on. So these, again, the places where the hives are going to be put. So you'll be able to walk and see many aspects of bee life. So again, not finished, just kind of snaps from my phone, looking at that. And then semi-finally, just to bring you up to speed on my own kind of teaching now, and how that Hook Park AA stuff can infuse other sort of more conventional architecture schools. I've been teaching at Reading for 4 years, where every year we do a project with second years that is a making project. So no drawing, and where the simple premise is that we design a building for the end of the year show that is designed through the making. So the first time we did it, we made this little grid shell structure by hand here, tested what it could be, pulled it into shape, made a simple diagram that we could upscale very quickly, laid these things out, and then with 45 students pulled, twisted and bent this timber into shape, not knowing what it would end up like. And that then became the place where the end of year show was hosted. So built in 4 days by second year students who had never built anything again before, and as part of a conventional university. 2 years later, we built a little urban room with them, did some drawings that time actually, because we gave a little bit of money, and students worked out how we could build a demountable structure that we could build that was up for 6 weeks, that hosted a series of activities linked to the urban room network. Various programs, artists came and ran events here for 6 weeks before it was taken down, and then went to a local primary school where it's now their outdoor classroom. Finally, semi-finally, the building that we're doing for Westonbirt now is a building that we're building with ex-addicts, ex-offenders, unskilled people, community groups. And again, these people are working with us to learn how to build a building through the kind of tacit experience of making. So we are, why I'm showing you this building is to really explore or help really articulate this idea that developing proposals for buildings for me is something that we do through many mediums. We do it through the physical act of making, we do it through drawing, we do it through computer modeling, we do it through model making. And this is a building that keeps going through all of those cycles. So first up, we made a building, we made a tentative proposal by hand like this, we made this on site with people, with their material. We then modeled that, we then scanned that model three-dimensionally and made a computer version, a rationalized computer version of that, looking at how we could actually build something. We then made some 3D proposals, looking at what scale that would be. We then decided we'd work out how we could build that with a kind of system, a kit of parts. So we kind of printed on A1 paper these kind of laths that we then cut out, overlaid, and marked on a whole series of laths, again with volunteers and these community groups who had never, again, picked up, adults with severe learning difficulties, had never made anything before. We began to prototype, and we made part of the building with them that we then scanned and analysed in the workshop, actually in the big shed at Hook Park, tested, and in conjunction with that, tested a new resin with flax for the translucent shingles we're going to make with them. We then made a 1:5 model of the entire building with them before drawing it again, tweaking it again, and then making another computer-generated model from this, out of which will fall the final fabrication drawings, which we'll make with them as soon as we're out of this kind of awful lockdown. And the other version of this, I'm not going to show you this project because we're out of time, and it's not relevant. It's a project that we were going to do at the Venice Biennale that, of course, we can't do anymore. Very finally, the last project, the first project I started with was Moonshine, my house, which I've kind of fallen out of love with, and I think we have just finished retrofitting that project that we built 20 years ago to make it super insulated, and so that's a wrong slide again because this talk is kind of corrupted, to make it super insulated and super airtight now. And so the project we self-built 20 years ago, we have now rebuilt this last summer. Everything that's yellow is overclad with another 450 mil of insulation. All that grey is where the additional insulation has gone outside of everything. We wrapped our entire house in a kind of duvet, put photovoltaics on the roof, linked to a battery backup, and then this is now the new house 20 years after we built the old house. Floor has raised with extra insulation and again, in-floor heating, electric in-floor heating linked to photovoltaics and PVs, much smaller windows on the north side because there's far too much heat loss, but still bigger windows on the south and the west side there. So we made the mistake 20 years ago of having far too much glass. We also depended on a tree for shade. When that tree died, the building overheated. So this is now a building that performs far better than the building that we built 20 years ago. And this is the inside, sort of still almost untouched. We just kind of built out from the inside, new glass, new cladding, new insulation, new membranes, new floor with insulation in, and left pretty much everything else as it had been. And we see the thickness of some of these kind of reveals now, you know, the otherwise building kind of as it was. I think that's kind of where I'm going to end, with this sort of point that much of what I've tried to describe to you is this sense that, you know, how can we ever design anything where that which is undesigned is far more beautiful than the things we designed. So this is a stack of bricks that I saw photographs sent to a friend of mine, Kate, who I work with, and she said, God, it's so hard being an architect, because the stuff that is around us that is undesigned is always far more beautiful than the stuff that is designed. That's it. So if anyone feels a burning need to ask a question, please do.
Thanks, Piers. We've got some questions in the chat. If
okay,
let's have
cool.
a look at them.
Benjamin
is the first one.
So design is really interesting. I mean, I think, you know, I studied with a guy called Glenn Murcutt that gave me a roadmap for very many of the things that I did at Moonshine. And he was an amazing teacher. And I thought about Glenn every day for about 25 years. And he worked by himself from his front room, and yet worked internationally, didn't employ anyone, did everything himself. And the kind of, you know, dignity of practice from Glenn was kind of mind-blowing. And the kind of frugality of his work, the tentative placing of a building in an extreme climate that worked out how to naturally ventilate and harness the kind of passive aspects of climate to make a building that was a delight to be in extremely hot climates was something that was kind of fascinating. Rural Studio next blew my mind when I discovered them. You know, rural Alabama, working in kind of poor southern states, America, working student outreach program, you know, just using found and scavenged materials, kind of blew my mind. The Chilean architect Elemental, a kind of extraordinary, and Chinese architects, amateur architecture, they're kind of extraordinary, I think. Ryan has said, when I mentioned places that need architecture, what does that mean? So, you know, we live in a pretty valley near a pretty town. This place, you know, the buildings that I built, the house isn't going to change anything for anyone. And the kind of beautiful buildings that we might build for some people don't really change anything. And I'm really interested in the consequences of buildings. And, you know, when we built those buildings in the south and east area of Bristol, Room 13, you know, the art studio with a concrete block, that place has benefited from that building. The building didn't change anything single-handedly, but it's part of a process of change where the building has helped inspire people, has helped bring hope, has helped bring about kind of social change. That place needed architecture, you know, and I would argue that the building in Watchet that place needs architecture, you know. And those places are very rewarding places. It doesn't mean I don't enjoy doing buildings in places that don't necessarily need architecture, but my point is that some places need architecture more than others. Pretty rural places don't really need any more private houses, however nice it might be occasionally to work on one. So planning, yeah, we do have to work on planning. All of these buildings have to navigate the process of planning. The studio happens to be a building that is essential for the purposes of forestry as well, because our business is managing woodland as well. But we take very seriously planning, CDM, all of that kind of stuff. It happens that the very few buildings we've done here don't typically have to navigate that stuff as comprehensively as the buildings that we do for proper clients. But all of those Western Belt buildings had to navigate all of that stuff. And actually, curiously, they're government buildings and the government self-certifies. They don't demand that you get building regs, but they're all building reg compliant buildings, as the ones are at Hook Park and all of the other buildings. So James has asked about Western Burt Arboretum. So back to Rebecca, actually. I mean, I think it's really important that that stuff is kind of mainstream. It's not just fringe stuff that you do in a kind of woodland somewhere. And I really think it's incredibly important that as architects, we're not just sculptors, that we do engage with the kind of grit of what it means to make a building that works. Western Burt, barely architectural. What I meant by that is that I enjoy, you know, in this rural context, not doing a building that people consider, again, as a kind of piece of architecture, but buildings that just seem like an inevitable kind of part of a place, an ordinary building that just feels that it might be something that a farmer might have built, and not a self-conscious building built by an architect full of the kind of architectural contortions that we might do on other buildings. You know, that's not to say we don't do those kind of buildings, but certain places I really like doing kind of super low-key buildings that are just almost a kind of off-the-shelf type building. Do we have a responsibility to solve social issues where possible? I mean, I think I do, I suppose, where I can. I do feel that responsibility. I can't tell everyone what to do, but I think life is immeasurably more interesting when you do. Because I think that, you know, if you just treat architecture as industrial design, it kind of gets boring. And, you know, we just design buildings as if it was an iPhone that we just drop down, or, you know, it doesn't really give us the opportunity to be part of a kind of network and a process of change. Those things are really interesting. Buildings are part of systems. And I think that being part of systems as designers is kind of fascinating. So I do think it's certainly very interesting to be part, to try and help solve social issues where possible. Where is one aspect in architecture you think as future architects we need to focus on in our projects now at university and those beyond this in the industry? Gosh, yes. It's a really interesting question, where to focus. I mean, I think that, you know, I think that what we're trying to do at Reading now, where we set up a new master's, is focus on what it is that we need to do to make change in a place. So we're working, you know, we've invited the Onion Collective, that group of 4 women who set up the community interest company, to work with our students, to go into a place with them, to help see a place through their eyes, to look at a place and to work out what is it about this place we need to change. So we know when we do a building that we can fit the building accurately to those things. And they're then giving us a kind of toolkit to work with. So over a period of some years, we will know whether or not those buildings have been successful. We're also working on buildings where we have real kind of live projects. That's not to say we build everything, but we work on live projects where we get feedback from the world, from clients, from users, from people on our buildings as a teaching and student group. And I think the problem with architecture is that when we judge buildings in architecture school, we judge them in architectural terms. We judge them whether we like them, whether spatially they're interesting. And those things are interesting, but they're only part of the story. And it's very confusing when you come out of architecture school, you do a kind of building and somebody doesn't like it, doesn't work, it's too expensive, it can't be built. And being exposed to the kind of grit of the world, I think is really important. And I think as much of that we can rub up against as students, the better. But you've asked me for one aspect, and I think, and I mean, you know, the world is burning, as we know, for many reasons, not just climatically. And I think, you know, we are reaching a point where we need to build buildings that can help be part of a process of change. So I'd say that's the one aspect. Will there be a series 3 of Extraordinary? Not with me. There is a series 3 of Extraordinary Homes, but I don't make that show anymore. Don't make TV anymore, and I only made that show because I needed to, when I was, I wanted to really be able to focus on developing a practice and a way of practice that could really tackle serious issues. And, you know, in terms of supporting that economically, I did make the decision to do that. But I thought that it could be an interesting idea to be able to open up a kind of way of making buildings that were inaccessible and make them accessible. But actually, ultimately, it's not very interesting, very clever, and it's fairly boring doing that kind of TV. So I fell out with the people that were making it because I wanted them to raise their game and make it more interesting. And now someone else is doing it. So there will be a series 3 of Extraordinary Homes, but not with me. I think that's the list of questions.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming to speak to us. It was so good to listen to what you have to
Sorry
say.
about the IT issues with yeah, sorry my slides didn't seem to work and we had to, but anyway, I mean, you know, it's not that important in the scheme of things.
Yeah, it happens, don't worry. Sorry about our issues as well.
Don't worry, that happens too. Thanks everyone. good luck with everything. It's a super hard time to be an architecture student. I don't envy you, but good luck, everybody, and keep the faith.
Thank you so much. All the
Yeah.
best.
Take care. See you soon. Bye, everyone. Bye.
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 Thank you.